In this chapter, we're going to talk about money growth and inflation. So if you've been watching the videos, if you've been keeping up, then what you probably realize is that at the early part of the semester, we talked about different measures of the health of an economy. So we talked about how to measure the price level with the CPI or the GDP deflator, and we talked about how to measure the income of a nation with GDP, nominal GDP and real GDP. We've talked about unemployment, and really what we were discussing were how those measures worked, how they were constructed, some of the strengths of them and the weaknesses, but we didn't really talk about what causes the price level to go up or down, or what causes the unemployment rate to rise. We did, in unemployment, we did talk a little bit about some of the causes of frictional and structural unemployment, so I guess we did there. But we didn't talk very much at all about what causes incomes to go up or down. We will in a future video. What we want to do now is focus really on what causes the price level to rise, to increase or decrease, what causes us to have inflation or deflation. Remember that we can measure inflation or deflation by looking at the percent change in either the GDP deflator or the CPI. And if you look at historically, at least in the United States, we've had inflation averaging probably for the last 60 years, averaging somewhere 4 or 5%. Some months it's a little bit higher, some months it's lower. And there are probably some months mixed in there where we've actually had some deflation. But if you were to go back and look at the 1800s, what you would see were periods of deflation, long periods of deflation. So it is not the case that it's the natural order of the world that prices always rise. If you think about, if you were to look at what people think are the most important things to avoid in an economy, so if you were to search through, say, news stories, and look for the most commonly used economic terms, you would see that inflation is one of the most feared things. For whatever reason, people seem to fear the presence of inflation. And so what we want to do in this chapter is we want to talk first about what causes inflation, and then we want to talk about what impact it has on an economy, and think about some of the costs that inflation can impose on an economy. We're going to be thinking in this chapter about what's referred to as the quantity theory of money. And we'll discuss that more here in just a little bit, but we're going to be thinking about the relationship between how much money there is in the economy. Remember, that's controlled by the Fed. Not precisely, but they're the ones that are charged with controlling it. And then what happens to the inflation rate. So we're going to be thinking about what we call a classical theory of inflation, and this is a theory that's attributable to David Hume, an early economist. What we want to do first is start by thinking about what happens if some price goes up. So let's suppose that a price increases from one year to the next, and maybe this is the price of gasoline. We could think about that. Well, what we know is we've talked about the demand and supply model, and so we know that probably the first place to start if we're thinking about why a price goes up is to think about what happens with demand and supply. So if you think about that basic demand and supply model, where we've got price up here and quantity down there, there are a couple of things that will drive price up. The first is that we could have an increase in demand from D1 to D2. That would drive our price up. If our price started here, our price is going to be driven up. So that's the first thing. It could be, if we observe price rising from one year to the next, it could be that demand for that good increased. It could also be, if we start again with our basic demand and supply model, it could also be that supply shifted to the left from S1 to S2. We had a decrease in supply. That would drive our price up also. So both of those things could have happened, or some combination of the two. Maybe we had an increase in demand and a decrease in supply. That would drive price up. So that's the first place to start thinking about it, but it's also the case that another thing could have happened, and that is that dollars buy less than they used to. There could have been inflation during that year. So inflation is really about the value of the dollars you have, not about the value of the goods and services that you buy. It's common for people to make the mistake of thinking that inflation is about the value of the goods and services out there, but it's not. It's really about the value of the dollars that you hold. So if we have an increase in the price level, if we have inflation, let's put it right here, increase in the price level, then that means that we have a decrease in the value of money. So let's think about how we're going to understand what causes this. Okay, what causes the value of money to go up or down? Let's start by thinking about this, the price level, P. So let's think carefully about what P measures. P is going to be representing the number of dollars needed to buy a basket of goods and services. Remember, P we can measure with either the GDP deflator or we can measure it with the CPI. So this is the number of dollars needed to buy that basket. Now let's think about that. Remember, the basket is a weighted average of all of the goods and services that consumers buy. And so if we were to look at, say, the price level, let's look at a price index. Let's just make up some numbers. Let's suppose we had 1987 and the price index was 100. So we're using 1987 as our base year. So let's suppose there was always a little bit of inflation. In 1986, then the price level could have been, say, 97. And in 1985, the price level could have been, say, 94. And then in 1988, then the price level is, say, 104. And in 1989, let's say the price level is 107. So because the price index is going up each year, we know there's some inflation. It's easy if we look at the difference between 1987 and 1988, because 1987 is our base year, so we know that between 87 and 88 there was 4% inflation. If we wanted to calculate these other inflation rates, we would need to calculate the percent change between 94 and 97. But what this is telling us, the way to think about this, is that that basket cost $100 in 1987. We've normalized it so that the basket costs $100 in 1987. In 1988, that same basket would cost $104. So each of our dollars is buying less. So we can think about this price level, P, as the number of dollars needed to buy the basket. In 1985, you would have only needed $94 to buy the basket. So what P is telling us is dollars per basket. Dollars per quantity, but let's put basket here. It's how many dollars you need to buy the basket. What we want to do is we don't want to think about dollars per basket. We want to think about number of baskets you can buy with $1. So what we want to do is we want to invert this and think about 1 over P. 1 over P, anytime you invert something, we're going to change invert the units of measure. So this is going to be number of baskets you could buy with $1. This is going to be baskets per dollar. Now, what this is giving us is essentially the quantity of goods and services you can buy with $1. Quantity of goods and services you can buy with $1. It's essentially the value of money measured in terms of goods and services. Now don't be confused by what we're doing here. This is going to be the value of money, okay? And this is the exact same idea as if you were thinking about driving 60 miles per hour. So there it would be 60 miles divided by hours, miles per hour. So in 1 hour, you can go 60 miles. If we inverted that, 60 inverted would be 1 over 60. That would be the, so let's write it, 60, that's miles per hour. Miles per hour. If we invert it to 1 over 60, that's hours per mile. And so that would tell you how far you could go in 1 minute, or excuse me, how long it would take you to go 1 mile, and that would be 1/60th of an hour. It would be 1 minute. Okay? So it's the exact same idea as what we're doing right here. We can look at it either in terms of miles per hour or hours per mile. In one case it would be 60, and the other it would be the inverse of that, 1 minute. So we're doing the exact same thing here. So let's think now about how the price level gets determined. What determines whether this goes up or whether it goes down? And the way that we're going to think about that is that we're going to think about the demand for money, we're going to think about the supply of money, and we're going to think about monetary equilibrium. Okay? So just like, you've probably heard me say this a lot of times, just like a lot of other things in this class, the price level is going to be determined by a demand and supply model. So let's start by thinking about money supply. Now, we've discussed money supply in a previous video, and we know that it's controlled by the Fed. But we know also that the Fed does not have precise control over it, because the actions of banks, as well as the actions of households, but mainly banks, the behavior of banks has a effect on the money supply. What we want to do for right now is just pretend as if banks have no impact on the money supply, and let's pretend as if the Fed has complete control over it. So what the Fed does is they can increase the money supply or decrease the money supply through open market operations, the buying or selling of bonds on the open market. So we're going to kind of ignore the banking system for right now. Now let's think about money demand. So money demand, how much money you choose to hold, whether that's money in your checking account or whether it's currency in your pocket. Let's think about your demand for money. The quantity demanded of money, how much money you actually hold, so let's say quantity demanded, is determined by the average level of prices in the economy. So it's determined by the average level of prices. So let's just put P there. The reason is that if the price level is high, you need more dollars to engage in transactions, to buy the things that you need to buy. When the price level is low, you need fewer dollars to buy the things that you need to buy. So the quantity demanded of money, how much money you hold at any particular time, depends upon the average level of prices in the economy. So the higher the level of prices, the more money you demand. So let's say the higher P is, the higher P, the higher the quantity demanded of money. Higher quantity demanded of money. And vice versa. The lower the price level, the lower the quantity demanded of money. Now, that helps us understand the shape of the money demand curve, but what we want to also think about just quickly is what causes demand for money to change. And so demand for money is going to be influenced by the substitutes for money. Those are things like credit cards. Credit cards. If people start using credit cards more often, remember using a credit card is not money. The reason is that what you're essentially doing is borrowing the money from the credit card company and then you pay them back later. So that's not a payment you're making right now. So using a credit card, that's a substitute for money. Or putting money in, say, a savings account, that's also a substitute for holding money. And so we could think about other less liquid assets. So the more people use savings accounts, the less money they hold. The more people use credit cards, the less money they hold. And whether or not people use credit cards, more or less, is determined by the interest rate they have to pay, things like that, any penalties that they would incur. So if credit cards start charging a lower interest rate on purchases, then people would use credit cards more and hold money less. So that money demand curve would shift to the left. So now that we know what the money supply curve, and we'll draw these here in just a second, but the money supply curve and the money demand curve, just like any demand and supply model, it's going to be the intersection of those two things that determines the monetary equilibrium, which what we'll see here in a second is that that's going to determine the value of money. So I need to clear this off, and then we'll take a look at monetary equilibrium. All right, let's think about the shape of the money supply and money demand curves here. Let's start by thinking about the money supply curve. If we were to graph, say, the relationship between the price level and the quantity supplied of money, it would be nice and easy because it's going to be a vertical line. We've probably talked about what the supply curve looks like for something that is available in fixed quantity. So if there's a certain amount of something, then the amount of it available is not going to be influenced by whether the price is high or low. And so the supply curve for that is going to be vertical. This is a little different here. This is not just a single price. This is the price level. But the money supply curve is going to look the same. It's going to be vertical at whatever quantity the Fed has determined the money supply to be. So remember, we're thinking about the Fed as being in complete control. And so this would be our money supply curve. Now let's talk about money demand. There's a challenge here with money demand, at least as we've defined it so far. If we were to put the price level up here and quantity demanded down here, then what we know is that at low price levels, down here, quantity demanded is low, and at high price levels, quantity demanded is high. And so if we were to draw the money demand curve with P, the price level, on our vertical axis, then what this would actually look like is a money demand curve that looks like that. And we know that demand curves don't look like that. So that discussion we had just a little bit ago, where instead of looking at P, we looked at the inverse of that, 1 over P, which represents the value of money, then if we will, instead of putting the price level on our vertical axis, if we will put the value of money on our vertical axis, then we know that when the value of money is high, people need to hold fewer dollars, and when the value of money is low, people need to hold more dollars. So if we were to do that, then our money demand curve looks like we're comfortable seeing a demand curve look. It's downward sloping. So when we draw these pictures, we're not going to be putting the price level on the vertical axis. We're going to be putting the value of money. So remember, anytime you see 1 over P, what you're looking at there is the value of money. It's the number of baskets that a dollar will purchase. Okay, so let's put together this picture of monetary equilibrium. I'm going to draw it a little bit bigger here because we're actually going to do something a little different. So we're going to put up here the value of money, 1 over P. On our horizontal axis, we're going to be thinking about the quantity of money. So this is Q, but it's the quantity of money. And then we're actually going to add another vertical axis over here on this end. we're going to put a vertical axis that goes up here, and on this axis we're going to put the price level. We're going to put P over here. Now we're going to be thinking about this picture mainly in terms of this axis, just like we normally do. But we also at the same time want to be thinking about the value of money and what the price level is. Now we're going with this axis to be measuring it in an inverse way. What we're going to be thinking about is that low levels of the price level are up here and high levels of the price level are down here. So we're going to, let me put some numbers up here, and I think once we do that you'll see exactly what we're talking about. So let's put, let's say, suppose we start with a value of money of 1. In that case, the inverse of 1 is also 1, and so our price level would be 1. Let's suppose that the value of money gets cut in half, so we could think about 1/2 down there. In that case, the price level would be 2. Or we could think about the value of money being 1/4, and in this case the price level would be 4. Or here would be 3/4, and right here would be 4/3. So what you can see is that the value of money is high up here. Let's put high, and low down here. So this axis works just like any other graph you've thought about. It's high as we move up and it's low as we move down. This one is high down here and low up here, simply because it's the inverse of this one over here. Okay, so high price levels are down here, low price levels are up there. Now if we think about the money supply curve, our money supply curve is vertical regardless of what we've put on the vertical axis, whether we're thinking about it in terms of price level or the value of money. So our money supply curve is going to look like this. Let's just put up here money supply. And our money demand curve, we know as long as we're graphing it with 1/P on the vertical axis, then our money demand curve is going to be downward sloping. Now, I'm going to draw this kind of a downward sloping curve here because this price level, as it goes up, we're getting closer and closer to infinity as we go here, but we would never actually reach it. So if you don't understand why this money demand curve is going to look like this, that's fine, but I'm going to have it intersect my money supply curve right here at 1/2. I'm going to have it come down kind of like this and curve off like that. So there's my money demand curve. So let's put here money demand. So we typically think about a demand curve as being downward sloping, but with the money demand curve, we're going to give it kind of, usually we think about it as linear. We're going to let this thing be kind of curved, but don't get worried about exactly why. It's not important. So the equilibrium here, just like any other equilibrium, is going to be found by the intersection of that money demand and money supply curve. So given the position of the money demand and money supply curve, the value of money will be 1/2. The price level would be 2. Our quantity, let's just say, is fixed by the Fed. So remember, it's the Fed that determines where that money supply curve is. So we get this nice demand supply of money. It helps us understand why the price level is what it is and why the value of money is what it is. But remember that the price level and the value of money are essentially two different ways of looking at the same thing. So let's think about what would happen if the price level was something other than the equilibrium. So suppose the price level was high, maybe it was 4, which means the value of money is 1/4. If that was the case, then we would have excess demand for money and the value of that money would be bid up. So the value of money, it would put upward pressure on the value of money, and we would end up with a higher value, a lower price level. Okay? Let's think now about what would happen if the Fed changes the money supply. And then we'll think about what happens if demand for money changes. So let me clear this off and then we'll take a look at that. All right, let's draw this picture again. So we've got, on this side we're going to be thinking about the value of money, and on this side we're going to put the price level, P. Down here we've got the quantity of money. We'll just call that Q. And let's go ahead and put our numbers like we did here. Let's suppose this is 1, which would put 1 over here. Here we've got 1/2, 1/4, 3/4. So over here would be 2, 4, 4/3. Let me move these over a little bit, 2, 4, so they're in the picture there. Let's go ahead and put our money supply. I'm going to put it kind of over here because we're going to increase the money supply. So I'm going to put it somewhere right over here. And I'm going to call this thing money supply. I'm going to call it MS1, money supply 1. So if we were to think about the money supply, let's put that down here also, money supply 1. That's going to be the quantity of dollars in the economy. Let's put our money demand curve on here. I want to start like we did in the previous picture with a value of money of 1/2. So I want my money demand curve to intersect right there. Have it move like that. There's my money demand. Let's just call it MD. We're not going to change that right now. So let's label our initial equilibrium point A here. So we're going to be starting at point A. So let's put our story here. Start at A. The price level is equal to 2. The value of money is 1/2. So it would take $2 to buy the basket, which means the value of money you could buy, this is the number of dollars per basket. This is the number of baskets per dollar. Okay. So you could buy 1/2 a basket with each dollar. Now let's think about what happens if we have an increase in the money supply. So suppose the money supply increases, let's suppose it doubles. Suppose the money supply doubles. So we're going to have a large increase in the money supply. So what I'm going to do, it turns out that if we have a doubling of the money supply, that's going to cut the value of money in half. So it's the value of money is going to go from 1/2 to 1/4. We'll talk about why here in a second. So if I were to double the money supply, I'm going to end up with a equilibrium right over here. Let's call it point B. So here's money supply 2. Shifts to the right, money supply 2. So we get a new equilibrium at B. When the money supply doubles, it cuts the value of money in half. So, and if we look at where the price level is, the price level, since our value of money goes from 1/2 to 1/4, the price level goes from 2 to 4. So the price level now is 4. Value of money is now 1/4. So essentially what has happened is that dollars are now more plentiful in the system. You've got this more dollars now chasing the same number of goods, and so each dollar is now less valuable. So because you've got more dollars chasing the same number of goods, essentially what that does is simply prices get bid up. This is what's known as the quantity theory of money. Quantity theory of money. So in a face-to-face class, I like to tell a story that happened to me many years ago, back when my kids were young. I don't remember exactly how old they were, but I think the boys were probably 5. I have twins. They were 5. My daughter was 3. Maybe the boys were 6 or 7, and my daughter was, I don't know, 4 or 5. Somewhere down there. Probably that's closer. And they all like to play Monopoly. We played a game of Monopoly back when they were young, and they just, for whatever reason, they loved the whole process. They loved the counting of the money, and they got to where they had memorized everything about the board, and they would want to play Monopoly all the time. It got to the point where my wife and I were just kind of tired of playing Monopoly, so they started playing by themselves, and because they had everything memorized about the board, they could play really fast. The 3 of them would get together and play, and they would play so fast that it was hard to keep up. And they would actually wear Monopoly sets out. And so we were someplace one time, and there was we went into a St. Louis Cardinals store, one of those stores where everything is Cardinals themed, and they saw a Cardinals Monopoly set, and they wanted it. And I initially said no. I said, we're not going to buy that. And then I thought about it. They all kept pestering me, and I thought, okay, well, you know, maybe that is a good buy because they really like Monopoly. And so we bought it. And we were headed back home, and the 3 of them were in the back seat talking, and one of the boys said, hey, I've got an idea. And the idea was to get rid of the old set, or quit playing with the old set of Monopoly, but to combine the money from that old set with the money from the new set. Double the money. And they all thought it was a great idea. And so essentially what was going to happen in that situation was that the amount of money in this game is going to double. And I knew that what was going to happen is something really close, actually pretty identical to what was going on right here. Now the way that they played back then was they liked to play a fast version of the game. And so what they would do is they would pull out a certain subset of the properties, and at the beginning of the game I would auction them off, or my wife would auction them off, and each kid would bid for whatever properties they wanted, and then they would start playing the game. So it's kind of a way to play a faster version of the game. And I knew that what was going to end up happening was that now each kid was going to have essentially twice as much money as before. So each kid was going to feel richer, and each one of them individually thought to themselves, my stack of money is twice as big, I can buy twice as much stuff. The problem was they didn't realize that the number of properties, the real thing about the game, wasn't going to change. It was just that everybody had twice as much money. And if everybody has twice as much money, they're going to be willing to pay twice as much as before. So prices are going to be driven up, but nothing real is going to happen with the game. And I knew that's what was going to happen, but they were really excited. We got home, they set up the game, they got the money from the old set, they put it with the new set, and they started playing the game. And they auctioned off the properties, and exactly what I thought was going to happen happened. Everybody bid about twice as much as what they bid normally. And then they started playing, and real quickly, as soon as they start playing, they start to realize it's the same game. It's just that now they've all paid twice as much for those initial properties. And then they were mad at me as if I had somehow tricked them into this, because I was sitting there just waiting for it to dawn on them what was going on. And so they looked at me as if I had played some cruel joke on them, but I hadn't. It was their idea to begin with. I was just there to watch the revelation, and it's exactly this. If you double the money supply, it's going to cut the value of the dollars in half. It's going to double the price level, But nothing real is going to change about the game. It's still the same number of goods and services out there. There's just more dollars chasing them, which means prices get bid up. And that's really the idea behind this quantity theory of money. There's a quote by Milton Friedman, a very influential economist that's passed away. But the quote was, Milton Friedman said, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon." Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And what he's saying there is that it's something about money, but it's not a real thing. It kind of goes back to that example that I've used in previous videos, where if you think about having $100 and each ice cream cone costing $1, that means that you can actually buy 100 ice cream cones. Well, let's change the prices. Let's suppose now you've got $100 or $200 and each ice cream cone costs $2. So we've just doubled the prices. Well, you can still only buy 100 ice cream cones. Nothing's really changed at all in terms of what real things you can buy. Before we kind of go into a little bit more about this quantity theory of money, let's real quick think about what happens if money demand changes. So let's put maybe a smaller version of this model up here. So we've got the value of money, 1 over P. We've got the price level. We've got some initial money supply and some money demand. So here's our money supply, here's money demand. Let's not worry about all the numbers here, because we really just want to think about what's going to happen to the value of money. And it's very intuitive when you think about what happens if, say, demand for money increases. So let's suppose that credit card companies raise their rates, or for some reason people decide to switch away from credit cards towards using more money. Maybe they don't quit using credit cards, but they use them less. And so the demand for money increases. If we have an increase, let's identify our initial equilibrium right here. If we have an increase in the demand for money, then we're going to move from that equilibrium at point A to a new equilibrium at point B, and that's going to drive up the value of money. It will also drive down the price level. Remember, the value of money and the price level are inverses of each other, so if the value of money goes up, the price level goes down. And you can see that if we were to start at this money demand, and if money demand were to decrease, it's going to drive down the value of money, which drives up the price level. Okay, so now we can think about what happens if the Fed changes the money supply, what it does to the price level or to the value of money. We can think about what happens if money demand changes. What we want to do now is think about the impact of a change in the price level on other macro variables in the economy. So let's clear this off and then we'll take a look at that. So David Hume suggested that we could take all economic variables and put them into two different categories, which we've actually talked about already in this class. We've talked about nominal variables, and then we've talked about real variables. And so what Hume said is that all economic variables can be grouped into those two categories. A nominal variable, hopefully you remember, is something that is denominated in monetary units. So it's measured in dollars. So let's put here measured in dollars, monetary units. So we've talked about things like nominal GDP. We've talked about nominal interest rates. There are other variables that we've also talked about, and those are real variables. So these are measured in physical units, not in dollars, measured in physical units. So we've talked about real GDP, we've talked about the real interest rate. The example that I just used previously when we were talking about the number of ice cream cones you can buy. So I gave you a nominal income of $100, and I gave you a price, a nominal price of $1 per ice cream cone. And then we converted that and figured out how many real ice cream cones you can buy. So your real income in that example would be 100 ice cream cones. The units of measure there are ice cream cones, physical units. But if we were to think about your nominal income, the $100, that's measured obviously in terms of dollars. So if we think about prices, it's a little bit odd to think about it in terms of price. So if we were to talk about a price is typically quoted in dollars. So that would be a nominal variable. But what we're interested in typically in economics is relative prices. So in that ice cream cone example, neither your nominal income nor your price matters by itself. The $100 of nominal income or the $1 price tag on an ice cream cone, neither of them matter individually. What matters is the relative nature of them. Your income relative to the price, or the price relative to your income. You can look at it either way. So when we think about relative prices, that's what we're going to be thinking about there. That's when we take your income and we divide it by the price to find out the number of ice cream cones you can buy. What we're thinking about there is a relative price. Okay, and it's relative prices that matters. So let me give you another example. Let's suppose a hamburger costs $1. And let's suppose a hot dog costs 50 cents. Or half a dollar. Then what that means is one hamburger costs 2 hot dogs. Or one hot dog costs 1/2 of a hamburger. That's what matters. It's that relative price. These individually do not matter. They only matter relative to each other. So when we talk about prices, prices are quoted in nominal units, in dollars. But when we think about relative prices, that's when we get the real measure. So relative prices are real measures. Nominal prices, these individually are nominal. Okay? So let's think about why this is important. What Hume said was that we can make this distinction between variables. An economic variable is either going to be nominal or real, and the money supply has an important influence over nominal variables but not real variables. So changes in the money supply affect nominal variables but not real variables. Not real. In the monopoly example, that change in the money supply affected the nominal prices of the properties, but it didn't affect anything real about how the game was played. There were still the same number of properties on the board. The game still worked the same way. It's just that the prices were different. So if you think about the discussions that we've had so far, if you've been watching the videos in this class, then you know that we've discussed a lot of different things. And a lot of the things that we discussed, the conclusions that we came up with, didn't really have anything to do with dollars. We can discuss a huge chunk of economics without ever really thinking about monetary units, without thinking about dollars. So we talked about real GDP, the real quantity of goods and services produced in an economy. That's not determined by the number of dollars in the economy. It's determined essentially by productivity of labor, how much natural resources we have, technology. It's determined by real things. We talked about the real interest rate. The real interest rate isn't determined by the number of dollars in the system, it's determined by the demand and supply of loanable funds. We talked about real wages and the fact that real wages, the real wage is determined by the demand and supply for labor. Okay? We didn't have to talk about dollars there. We talked about unemployment. Unemployment is determined by the demand and supply for labor and adjustments in the real wage, not the nominal wage. So a lot of the discussions that we've thought about in this class, we talked about without thinking about dollars. Remember, even when going as far back as to talk about the production possibility frontier and how much of each good an economy can produce, real GDP. It had to do with where that production possibilities frontier was. And we talked about the opportunity cost of each good, but we didn't talk about it in terms of dollars. We talked about it in terms of how much of the other good you had to give up to get more of this good. So all of those discussions are discussions about real variables, not nominal variables. None of these had anything to do with money. So we've got another name for this. We call this monetary neutrality. Monetary neutrality. And that monetary neutrality, that is really the name that we give the idea that changes in the money supply are irrelevant for real variables. Okay? Real variables are monetarily neutral. Another way to think about what's going on here is to think about, say, the clock that we use. We use a clock that's based upon a division of 12 units. It's a base 12 clock. And each half day is divided into 12 hours. The military uses a different clock. They use a base 24 clock where each day is divided into 24 segments. But we don't have to do that. We could create a new clock where there are 100 hours in the day. But the day is actually not going to change. If we did that, there would monetarily be more hours in the day. But in terms of the actual day that we experience, it's no longer or shorter. We've just broken it up into smaller increments. And so that's essentially what's going on right here. Now, we're not saying that inflation or that changing that clock would be costless. We'll talk about some of the costs associated with inflation, especially high levels of inflation. Just like if we changed the clock, probably there would be a period of time during which it was confusing. Somebody would say, I'll see you at 75 o'clock, and you'd have to say, gosh, 75 o'clock, I'm just not sure exactly when that is. I think that's at night, but I'm not sure. So there would initially be some confusion until you got used to it, but what you would realize is that wouldn't have any impact on anything real. Let's talk about velocity and the monetary equation, or the quantity equation. So let's start by thinking about what velocity is. So velocity is how many times per year the typical dollar bill would be used to pay for a newly produced good or service. So the number of times a dollar is spent in a year on a newly produced good or service. That's what we think about when we're talking about the velocity of money. It's the speed at which a dollar travels around that circular flow diagram, essentially. The velocity of money we can define, we're going to call it V. The velocity of money we define as P times Y divided by M. So this V stands for velocity, P stands for the price level, Y stands for real GDP, and M here is going to be our money supply. It's the quantity of money in the system. In my pictures that I had up here, I called the money supply MS. Here I'm just going to call it M. So what this tells us is that the velocity of money, the way that you would calculate it, is to look at the total amount of economic activity that takes place in the economy. This is the number of goods and services produced in the economy times the price level divided by the number of dollars in the system. So this is the total amount of economic activity divided by how many dollars there are, and that gives you velocity. Let's do a quick example. Let's suppose that we have a nice simple economy where only one thing is produced, and that one thing is going to be pizzas. Let's suppose there are 100 pizzas produced per year. Let's suppose the price is $10 per pizza. And let's suppose the quantity of money in the system is $50. That's our quantity of money. Then let's think about the velocity. So if there is 100 pizzas produced each year at $10 each, that's going to be the price, which is 10, times 100. That's $1,000 of economic activity that takes place in the economy. But there's only $50 in the money supply. So if we have $1,000 of economic activity and only $50 in the system, that means each dollar has to be spent on average 20 times. The velocity of money would be 20. So if you have $50 in the system, each dollar being spent on average 20 times each, that would account for $1,000 of economic activity. We can rewrite this. If we just simply multiply both sides by M, we can write M, the money supply, multiplied by the velocity of money, the average number of times each dollar is spent each year on a newly produced good or service, is equal to P times Y. P times Y over here, this is just nominal GDP. It's the price level multiplied by real GDP. Okay? This is what we call the quantity equation. So nominal GDP, the nominal amount of economic activity that is taking place in the economy, is equal to the number of dollars in the system multiplied by the number of times each dollar is spent on average. Let's think about what causes each of these things to change, or what determines the money supply, what determines velocity, the price level, and real GDP. So if we think about increasing the money supply, if we increase the money supply in order for this equation to hold, then that has to lead to one or more of the following things. In order to maintain the equality by increasing the money supply, we have to either see that we have a decrease in velocity, or we would have to have an increase in the price level, or we would have to have an increase in real GDP. Why? To maintain that equality. If this variable goes up, then to maintain the equality, this one has to go down, or that one goes up, or that one goes up, or some combination of all three of those things. It turns out that if we look at the velocity of money, that's relatively stable. This tends to be relatively stable over time. So we don't tend to see the velocity of money changing very much. We also know that real GDP is determined not by the number of dollars in the system, but determined by productivity. So this isn't affected by dollars. This is affected by the productivity of labor, by technology. So what we tend to see is that an increase in the money supply is going to be reflected with an increase in the price level. Okay? So what we need to do now, I need to clear this off, and then we'll kind of finish up this chapter with a couple of things. So now we have a better understanding of what causes inflation, at least in the long run. So what we've talked about here is this quantity theory of money, that the changes in the price level are going to be related to changes in the money supply. We've talked about monetary neutrality, the idea that when the money supply changes, when we have changes in the price level, that's going to affect nominal variables, but it doesn't affect real variables. Again, all of this is a long-run idea. We'll talk about the fact that a change in the money supply can have an impact on some real variables in the short run. That's in another discussion that we'll have. But in the long run, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's not something that has enormous, large impacts on real variables. Now, we can talk about very high rates of inflation. So if we talk about what's known as hyperinflation, hyperinflation would be inflation that exceeds, say, 50% per month. So remember at the beginning I talked about the average rate of inflation that we tend to see in the U.S. economy is somewhere maybe in the neighborhood of 4 to 5%. It depends on the year. And that's 4 to 5% per year, so less than 1% per month. So if we're thinking about high rates of inflation, higher than 50% per month, that's a lot of inflation. That is rapid increases in the price level, rapid decreases in the value of money. And kind of the classic example of hyperinflation is what happened in Zimbabwe. I actually have some currency from Zimbabwe. So in 2007, the Zimbabwe government decided to start printing money. There were a variety of reasons why they decided to start doing that, but they started printing money, and they were printing money rapidly. They continued that for a while until I believe they eventually ran out of money printing supplies and contracted with some other governments to print money for them. Eventually it all stopped, and they had to switch to using US dollars because they had some very severe problems in their economy. But let's talk about what happens when an economy does that. When you have an economy where they're printing large quantities of money, then what that does, we've seen, is it devalues the money. So the value of money starts falling rapidly, and what that means is people need to carry large quantities of money to buy things. So as Zimbabwe started printing money very rapidly, the value started to fall, and people were having to carry wheelbarrow loads of money, of bills, to make purchases. So what the government decided to do was to print bills in larger denominations. Now, you won't be able to see these, but we'll put a picture up here so that you can kind of see a couple of these. But what these are bills from Zimbabwe in 2007. They had a $1 bill, they had a $5 bill, they had a $10 bill, a $20, and a $1,000 bill. And these are bills that are very similar to what you would see in any country. They started printing money. The value of their currency started to fall, and so as they were printing money, they started to print higher denominations. And so still in this is early 2008, they decided to print a $500,000 bill. That's that bill. They then went to a $50 million bill, a $200 million bill, a $500 million bill. This is still in 2008. They went from there to a $1 billion bill. That is a $1 billion bill. Still would not buy very much of anything in Zimbabwe at the time. They printed a $5 billion bill, $10 billion, $20 billion, $50 billion. Here's a $10 trillion bill, $10 trillion. Here's a $50 trillion bill, and then finally a $100 trillion bill. Still would not buy very much of anything in Zimbabwe because the price level was rising so rapidly, the value of their money was falling so rapidly that essentially they other countries stopped printing money for them, and again, they had to switch to using the US dollar or currencies from other countries because the Zim dollar, Zimbabwe's currency, had no value. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly how much inflation they were experiencing because they quit reporting official statistics. But there are some estimates out there, and it turns out that if you estimate at the height of the inflation how much inflation they were actually experiencing, it was something around 800 billion% per month. 800 billion% per month. If you look at how much inflation per year that is around 90 sextillion% per year. Now, those are estimates. We don't know exactly how much it was, but the point is that is incredibly high inflation. Okay, if you think about inflation in the U.S., 4 to 5%. In a year with high inflation, maybe something around 7, 8, 9%. Way lower than what was experienced in Zimbabwe. And it's not just Zimbabwe. Other countries have experienced hyperinflation. But what's happening there is that the government is printing money rapidly that's devaluing their currency and driving up the price level. Let's talk about what we call an inflation tax. So you might ask, well, if this is obvious that if the government increases money, the money supply is just going to create inflation, it's going to cause our dollars to be less valuable, why would a government do this? Well, when a government is doing this, we say that the government is imposing an inflation tax on its citizens. So essentially, the government is using money creation as a way to pay for some of its spending. So they create new money and it devalues the money that we have. They're able to spend a few more dollars, and we bear the cost of that. In terms of how much money the U.S. government creates, well, if we're experiencing, say, 4% inflation per year, then that gives you an idea of what the rate at which they're increasing the money supply is, around 4%. Let's talk about the Fisher effect, which is actually something we've already discussed in a previous video, but we didn't call it the Fisher effect at that point. But what the Fisher effect is the application of monetary neutrality to interest rates. So we know that the real interest rate, let's just call it R, the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. We can rearrange that and say that the nominal interest rate is equal to the real rate plus the rate of inflation. Now, changes in the money supply are going to cause, if we have an increase in the money supply, we know that that's going to cause an increase in the inflation rate. The real interest rate is not determined by the quantity of money in the economy. The real interest rate, remember we talked about that, the real interest rate is determined by the demand and supply of loanable funds. So what the Fisher effect tells us is that money creation by the government will cause inflation and drive up nominal interest rates, but will not affect real interest rates. Okay? This is that classical dichotomy, that a change in the money supply will affect the nominal interest rate, but not the real interest rate. We call that the Fisher effect. The Fisher effect, again, is something that holds in the long run. We can talk about what happens in the short run. We'll discuss that in a later discussion. But keep in mind, all of these things about monetary neutrality and the classical dichotomy are long-run ideas, not so much short-run ideas. Let's talk about, finish up by thinking about the costs of inflation. So we've said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't impose some costs on us. So I've already mentioned that it's probably the most discussed, the most feared thing that people in the general public would think about happening in an economy. But in terms of its effect in the long run, it doesn't matter. It's a monetary phenomenon. But it does impose some costs. Let's think about a few of them. Different textbooks have different names for some of these, but here's what we're going to call these. The first one we could call the shoe leather cost. And the idea here is that inflation results in more frequent trips to the bank to get cash to engage in transactions. Now, most people these days use a debit card, and so you don't actually have to go to the bank to withdraw cash to make transactions. So this isn't as big a cost as what it used to be when more people had to carry cash. But we still say that it results maybe in more frequent transfers of money from your savings account into your checking account so that you can engage in transactions. So it increases the number of times you have to think about the amount of money that you're holding. We call that the shoe leather cost. There's also what we call menu costs. So this is a cost associated with repeatedly having to change prices. So you can think about maybe a restaurant printing up some menus where they have prices of different items on there. And then if the economy is experiencing a lot of inflation and those prices need to be adjusted frequently, then that's going to impose some costs on that restaurant in terms of printing up new menus. It's not just restaurants, any business that posts prices, whether those prices are posted on signs or on stickers on the item or on little signs under the item or on a catalog that they may mail out or maybe on a website. As prices change frequently, they have to go and change those prices, and we just call those menu costs. There's also relative price variability. And the idea here is that when we experience inflation, it's not the case that all prices change by the same amount. Prices do not change proportionally. Some prices may go up more than others. Some prices may actually go down. But inflation creates relative price variability, and so it increases the amount of thought that you have to give to the things that you buy. Okay? And that imposes costs on us. There's also what we would call inflation-induced tax distortions. Inflation-induced tax distortions. So it's often the case that lawmakers change laws and then fail to take into consideration the fact that inflation can distort the incentives that people face. And when people face different incentives, we know that their behavior is going to change. So it can create distortions in behavior that lawmakers don't anticipate. And then let's just say that one of them kind of related to that, just confusion and inconvenience. In the same way that if we change the clock to a base 100 clock, that would initially create some confusion. It would be hard to figure out exactly what part of the day a particular time might be referring to. So it creates some confusion and inconvenience when prices are constantly changing. If you were in Zimbabwe when those prices were rising that rapidly, those prices are going up second by second. So a roll of toilet paper in the morning would cost a different amount than that roll of toilet paper in the evening. That creates confusion and inconvenience. It makes it hard to plan for the future. And then the final one, let's talk about arbitrary redistribution of wealth. Arbitrary redistribution of wealth. The idea here is that unexpected inflation will impact people who borrow money and people who lend money. So let's write out here what it does, and then I'll give you an example of why. Unexpected inflation helps borrowers. Unexpected inflation helps borrowers. It hurts lenders. It hurts creditors. Let me give you an example of why. Let's suppose that we live in Zimbabwe and I borrow $1,000 from you right now, before all of that inflation happened. I borrow $1,000 and we don't know that all that inflation is going to happen. We're just going about our business and I say, hey, look, I'd like to borrow $1,000 from you. And so you lend me $1,000. And in a year, I'm going to be paying you back this $1,000 plus some interest. And then over the course of that year, the Zimbabwe government starts to print money and the value of money starts falling. We experience high rates of inflation. And neither of us expected that, but the agreement between us is that in 1 year, I'm going to pay you back $1,000 plus some interest. And then over the course of that year, there's this tremendous amount of inflation. And at the end of the year, I say, hey, I owe you $1,000. So how about this? How about if I just give you a $100 trillion bill and we'll just call it even? And this thing's worth hardly anything. It's worth less than what that $1,000 was a year ago that I borrowed. So that unexpected inflation is going to help me as the borrower. I get to pay you back with dollars that are worth less than when I borrowed them. The unexpected inflation hurts the lender. If we knew that that inflation was going to happen, then you would build that into the contract that we had. If you knew over the course of the year there was going to be a whole bunch of inflation, then you would build that inflation into the nominal interest rate that you charge me. You would need to get some real rate, and then you'd say, okay, we're going to be experiencing this high rate of inflation, so I'm going to take the real rate I need to get, plus the inflation we're going to experience, and you're going to have to pay this nominal rate. But if you don't expect the inflation, then you're going to charge me a nominal rate that is lower than what you needed to charge me. So unexpected inflation arbitrarily redistributes wealth. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what the cause of inflation is, at least in the long run. This idea of the quantity theory of money, the quantity of money being directly related to the value of that money. Hopefully now you understand that nominal variables are impacted by changes in the money supply and real variables aren't in the long run. And then we've talked a little bit about some of the costs of inflation. So we'll think about how things happen in the short run in a future discussion, and I'll see you in a future video.